What pregnancy feels like. A letter to my future self. Dear future Nicole, you've had 2 beautiful children, a boy and a girl. This is what you wanted, and the original plan is to stop after 2 kids. That feeling of being pregnant, it's a feeling you'll never experience again. So I'm writing this letter to remind you of those feelings before the memories fade away with time. The good and the hard. For you, there was a lot of hard. The first time you were pregnant, you were so sick for so long. You'll never forget that time you were laying on the bathroom floor in your small apartment, thinking that nothing in life could feel harder than this. That even childbirth would be easier than being this sick, because childbirth is only a temporary pain. You threw up multiple times per day, wondering when this would end. You took plastic bags with you when you were driving, just in case you would throw up. You were hungry, but had no desire for any of the food you had. Everything sounded disgusting. The smell of onions made you throw up, and you got irritated at your husband for cooking them. You became sensitive to many, many smells. And you hated whenever anybody brought food onto an elevator. You could no longer stomach salads, and you always loved salads. You cried a lot, wondering if you made the right decision in getting pregnant. It felt like a torture with no end date in sight. When you were awake, you were sick. Thank goodness for the fatigue that helped you sleep through some of this time period. After the first trimester passed and the sickness continued, you felt hopeless. But then in the summer, you moved out of your tiny apartment into a house, and your all-day nausea slowly began to fade. It may have just been a coincidence that the nausea faded after the move, or maybe the fresh air in a new environment helped. But you slowly felt better, more energized, and happier at 5 months pregnant. Around this time, you started to feel baby Danny move inside you, or at least you thought you did. In the beginning, you weren't sure if it was gas, digestion, or a baby. It felt like tiny little butterfly flutters. As time passed, you knew this was definitely a baby moving. And pretty soon, those flutters turned into kicks. And before you knew it, you had a little arm or a leg stretching inside you, turning your belly into the weirdest of shapes. It was fascinating, mesmerizing. You constantly grabbed your phone to try to capture the movements on camera when they happened. Before you had a baby, you thought it was strange that pregnant women always had their hands on their bellies. Well, now you were doing it too. Whenever you were out, you were constantly touching your belly. Sometimes you were trying to feel a movement, other times you were doing it out of habit. You didn't even notice it anymore. Everywhere you went, people were commenting on your stomach. They thought you were much further along than you actually were. People left and right were guessing the gender, and every single one of them guessed boy. Even the random employee at Home Depot. As you got bigger, everyday tasks became harder. You stopped wearing sneakers and started wearing your slippers everywhere. Less bending. You hated reaching anything at the bottom of the dishwasher or at the bottom of the pantry. And whenever your husband organized things down there, you were mildly irritated. You got annoyed when anything was too far down. The effort to bend down and get those things was just not worth it to you. You dropped things and they stayed on the floor for a while. Getting in and out of bed became more challenging. You could only sleep on one side, facing to your right. No other position would work. Everything was hard now. Even sitting up and working on your laptop was hard. It just wasn't easy to get comfortable anymore. You wondered how those picture-perfect influencers on Instagram were working out, lifting weights, and looking perfect during their pregnancies, right until the very end. That last week of pregnancy was hard, but still not as hard as the first few months. And finally, the day arrived, the day that your baby was born. Your pregnancy was over. You were relieved. Being pregnant is hard. You had heard other people talking about how they missed being pregnant. You definitely didn't miss it. Even though you still looked pregnant after giving birth, you felt so light, like a big weight had been lifted from you. The hardness of your belly was replaced with a soft and squishy belly. When you took your first walks outside, you felt hollow, like you had a half-empty cup of water inside you, swishing around, or kind of like a deflated balloon. It was a strange feeling and hard to describe. A little over a year later, you were pregnant again. And at the 6-week mark on New Year's Eve, the all too familiar feeling of nausea crept back in. You were hopeful that it would be easier than the last time around. In those first few weeks, you did spend a good amount of time with your head over the toilet, but the hardest part was the extreme fatigue. When you got home from work and were taking care of Danny, an energetic little toddler, you felt guilty that you couldn't play with him the way you wanted to. All you wanted to do was sleep. The first trimester was hard in a different way. Although the sickness was not as bad as the first pregnancy, you couldn't rest because of your 1-year-old. You still had to cook dinner, take care of him, bathe him, play with him. The guilt was immense. Eventually, the sickness faded. You looked huge, much bigger than the first pregnancy. Everyone made comments. You had more cravings and a bigger appetite with this pregnancy. You craved sweets, something you did not crave in the first pregnancy and something you don't generally crave at all. Then you started to feel butterflies and eventually kicks. And pretty soon, baby Emma was sticking her legs out in the exact same way that Danny was. Both of your babies were positioned in a way that you always had a lump moving around on the right side of your belly. With your first pregnancy, you were hyper-focused on every movement the baby made. This time around, you were so distracted by your toddler that you barely had time to focus on yourself. You mostly paid attention to the movements at night when your toddler was in bed and you could feel the baby moving. With both pregnancies, you always felt the baby moving more at night. Once you stopped working, the real work began. Being in your final trimester and chasing a toddler felt like the hardest thing you ever had to do. You couldn't rest. At night, you had trouble sleeping. You had insomnia, heartburn, and had to pee constantly. But despite the challenges, you made it through that period of time while also taking your son to farms, the pool, and playgrounds on a regular basis. You were doing pretty good considering the circumstances. Putting your toddler to sleep became challenging. As you laid down with him on his floor bed and he was crawling all over you, you had to protect your belly from him. It became harder to hold him on the rocking chair or to hug him the way you used to. You often reflected on your first pregnancy, remembering how much time you had for napping, floating in the pool, watching TV shows, and sitting in the backyard looking at the hummingbirds. You had no idea how good you had it back then, you thought. Now you were cooking, cleaning, entertaining, and running. You couldn't wait for the baby to get here. Surely, everything would be easier if you could have your body back. In that last week of pregnancy, you developed bronchitis and the hard became harder, but you somehow made it through. You had a beautiful birth and completed your little family of 4. For you, pregnancy was hard, both times. But despite the hardship, there's something magical about having a tiny little human growing inside of you. A tiny human that you feel all day long wherever you go and whatever you do. So future Nicole, never forget that you were able to get through some of the hardest things in life. Pregnancy is hard. Childbirth is hard, having a newborn is hard, and having 2 kids is hard. But all of it is doable. You were scared of all of it, and you still managed to get through it. You don't know the road ahead, but this chapter of your life, perhaps the hardest one, is complete. So I hope that was somewhat interesting for you. If you're currently pregnant or if you've been pregnant before, feel free to share your experience in the comments. I know it's different for everybody. Some people have a very easy pregnancy. Some people work out while they're pregnant. Some people put on makeup every day and they just look flawless. Pregnancy was just not that for me. It was hard. And if it's hard for you too, just remember that in hindsight, it's actually a very short period of time in your life and you're gonna get a beautiful baby out of it who will become a beautiful toddler and just be the love of your life. So if you enjoyed this letter that I wrote to myself, feel free to give this video a thumbs up. That would mean a lot to me. And feel free to subscribe to the channel if you are new here. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next video.